Welcome to Quality Time with MoreSteam. I am your host, Dan Swartwout. Today, Lean Six Sigma Black Belt April Thomas joins the program. April began her career as a social worker in hospice care, and now she brings that human-centered perspective to continuous improvement. April's mission is to be an advocate, a catalyst, and a coach for transformational change. On this episode, we talk about April's background, how riding a motorcycle can be applied to continuous improvement. Yes, motorcycles, pretty cool, and why a grief-informed approach can help transform how leaders handle change. And now, my conversation with April Thomas. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, April Thomas. April, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm really glad to be here.
We are thrilled to have you here with us. And one of the things that I always find fascinating is how people end up where they're at in Lean Six Sigma, in process improvement. Josh Howell started working at a Starbucks, for example, the president of LEI. You have also had a very unique journey. Would you tell us a little bit about that, April?
Yeah, so I didn't start my career thinking like, hey, I'm going to end up in continuous improvement, process improvement strategy. I started my career as a social worker. And
Wow.
I started in healthcare as a hospice, palliative care, nursing home, social worker. I didn't learn about continuous improvement or concepts about continuous improvement and Lean and Six Sigma until 2007. When I had the privilege to be employed at Theta Care at Home, which was home care and hospice, and was in a team lead role. And it was when Theta Care was really heavily into engaging Lean and Six Sigma, not only for business and process operations, but clinical care. And so I was really privileged to be selected to go through the Theta Care Improvement System internship, to be able to learn about continuous improvement principles and then go back and be able to apply them and participate in Kaizen or rapid improvement events that we had, to be doing some 5S projects. And so that's where I learned about this knack I had for creating systems and processes, but didn't know that it had a name until 2007. And found that I really loved helping to create systematic transformational change, because as social workers, right, we're trained to be collaborative system thinkers, problem solvers, both at the micro and macro level. And so for me, once I learned about it, it seems kind of this transition of applying skills that I learned as a social worker and working with individuals, and just working on that macro piece, right, applying it to systems and organizations, and figuring out, right, how do I help leverage people's talents to the best of my abilities to help them grow, to be able to help create that systematic change, to be able to help make processes run smoother so people could do the work they really wanted to do that added value to patient care and processes, and so that's how I ended up going this transition from being a direct practice social worker. And even in the roles that I had in healthcare, was applying those principles to like clinical best practices, how to make that care better, how to create experiences around patient care and engaging families. Yeah, so it's been this transition of direct practice to organizational development, to help facilitating and leading processes in different areas of healthcare, to consulting, working with manufacturers, working in higher education, and supporting nonprofits as a board member too.
Looking back, I mean, it's a fascinating career journey that you've had. Looking back at your time working in hospice care, what did that work teach you that you had no idea would be so valuable in helping organizations change later on?
One, being really privileged to be a part of people's lives and stories, and really taking that time to be able to get to know people and to learn about their story. And I think when you work with people who are facing life-limiting and potentially, just life-limiting experiences, and who know that they're dying, you learn a lot about living. And about like what brings you joy, what brings them joy, quality of life. And I think one of the biggest things that I learned was you die once, but you have the choice to live every day. And how am I going to live every day as I can to the fullest and make the most out of that? And I think about this in relation to I've recently received my motorcycle license and I'm learning to ride. And one of the things that they teach us is right being aware of what's 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 12 seconds ahead of you. And I think that's a lot of what we need to be thinking about from that perspective is what's 2 seconds ahead of us, what's 4 seconds, what's 12 seconds ahead of us, knowing what's our escape path and where we might need to change or navigate with different risk situations that may present in front of us.
I'm really curious now. This is a little off topic, but I was unaware of your motorcycle riding, becoming a licensed motorcycle rider. What caused you to do this? Are people surprised when they find out that, that you just decided to start riding a motorcycle?
I first wanted to learn how to ride back in, I think it was 2010 when I lived in Wisconsin, Manitowoc State Fair. And we were walking around and there was a Harley Davidson booth set up. And they had a whole bunch of bikes. And I remember sitting on a couple of them and it was like, I want to learn how to ride this. And I wanted to learn how to ride ever since then. And I just need the opportunity and life never presented for that to happen. And, this past year, my daughter was talking about, she's like, she's seen people ride motorcycles and she was like, I want to learn how to ride. And she's 18 at the time. She's now 19. And I'm like, she heard me talking, right? And I'm like, how about we do this together? And we were like, heck yeah. So we signed up and we did motorcycle lessons together. We did a kind of a pre-course together because, neither one of us had ridden motorcycles before and driving them. And we were like, we know there's risks involved, but we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to mitigate the risks.
That is so cool. And I have to ask, what are some things you've learned from motorcycle riding and motorcycle lessons that you can apply to continuous improvement? This is fascinating stuff, April.
Yeah. So looking out onto the horizon, right? What's 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 12 seconds ahead of you in terms of where you're going, knowing what the risks are, what your strategy is to mitigate it. And like I teach us as riders, right? You're pretty much invisible. So how are you going to make yourself visible? And so being able to think about, right, how do you embed continuous improvement into your processes so it's not invisible, so that it just becomes a part of what you do. The one thing I learned, right, front brake on a motorcycle, use it extremely judiciously. You do not, I got a trophy and I was even though I was going really slow, right, and had a handlebars just turned a little bit to the right, hit the front brake too hard, doesn't take a whole lot of inertia, and tipped it over. And I broke off part of the front brake. And that was my trophy. And it was one of those learnings where it's thinking, right, yep, as an organization, you need to be really cautious about what you're hitting the brakes on, because it doesn't take much for you to become off course and off path really quickly. And it's not going to take much to tip you over and get you off the direction. The other thing we talk about is, especially with turning, where you look is where you're going to go. So you need to know where you want to go, because wherever you're looking is where the bike's going to go. And thinking about that organizationally and directionally, where you're going to go, wherever you're looking. But you also have to be very conscientious of your blind spots. And are you riding in blind spots? And so as an organization, right, being aware of what might your blind spots be and how are you going to navigate or move out of them? Because as a rider, we don't ever want to stay in a vehicle's blind spots because it puts us at risk. I think the other really big thing, growth mindset and performance and coaching, right? So, coaching to be able to be like, you did this really well, right? Great braking. Okay, now turn your handlebars, lock right, look right, now go. Things like that. And being able to say, how are you coaching from a strengths perspective, right? Because as a social worker, that's what I was taught too. How do you coach from a strengths perspective? How do you meet people's skills where they're at? Coach them on what they're doing well, right? You did awesome with that. I think the other really big thing, growth mindset and performance, because I could see that in my performance when it would be I put in the clutch and I missed second gear. I didn't have that smooth transition like I wanted to, so then it was more jerky and being if I would say to myself, oh my gosh, you know better than this. Hello. Versus yep, you didn't do it as great as you wanted to, but you maintained it, right? You transitioned to second year. It didn't go as smoothly as you wanted, but now you know what you need to do differently for the next time. And saying like, yep, you learned. You learn as much about what to do versus maybe what not to do. But, being able to then really kind of embrace like, yep, you're going to have learnings along the way, and just how to be able to embrace that and saying like, yep, I learned this and now I know I need to do this a little bit differently.
One of the things we were talking about earlier is we were talking about change. And when you walk into an organization and see what others might label as resistance to change, what are you actually observing? How does your background change how you look at that dynamic, the resistance to change?
Yeah, right. So I expect resistance when there's change taking place. I tend to view it from the lens of grief and loss. Right. I know a lot of people are familiar with Elizabeth Tabor-Ross, and from hospice, I'm very familiar with her work, saw that when I worked with individuals who had terminal or life-limiting illnesses. But when it comes to looking at resistance in organizations and change, I actually really like Therese Rando's model better, because her model is focused on mourning, which is after somebody has died. And what is that process? And so when I look at organizations and look at resistance and I look at it through that grief and loss lens, it's really about where are people at in terms of processing that grief and accepting change and stepping into it. And so being able to look at behavior as nonverbal communication. So being able to say what behaviors have changed, and where are people at in terms of maybe their commitments or like language that they're using. So I think when I look at it from that lens of grief and loss, it helps me to be able to identify where are people at and what support do they need to be able to help through and help to kind of walk through those stages of change, and where are they at in terms of grief and loss and acceptance. And I think to me that just kind of personalizes and humanizes the experience. Change is personal, and it's affecting people, and people take time to be able to adjust and adapt. And that's where those change management plans become so critical. Is, you've got the process piece, which is about how are we going to do things differently. But change management is about how are we going to meet people where they're at and support them through the change.
The resistance to change, change fatigue, employee well-being. How should process improvement professionals balance the need for continuous improvement with change fatigue and employee well-being? How do you balance all of that?
When we've got change fatigue, that it also increases the risk of burnout for individuals, anxiety, other mental health concerns. And how you tend to see that is if people are starting to maybe become more irritable, and if they're starting to notice greater absenteeism, lack of productivity, cynicism. You're starting to see employees withdraw where previously maybe they've been engaged, now they're disengaged. They're starting to see, like I said, maybe absentee rates go up. Because I think at times organizations underestimate the emotional impacts that change takes on individuals. And so that's where I think being very mindful and thoughtful about what changes are we looking to implement? Why are we looking to implement them? How does this relate back to a larger strategy that is critical to organizational success and business operations? Because when employees are just experiencing constant change, it's disruption, and it's not then, like I said, being very purposeful. And so kind of balancing those things out, figuring out, are these projects that we really need to take on and for business growth operations, right? Because organizations need to stay viable. They need to stay competitive. There's work that needs to be done to continue to do that. But like I said, it's kind of balancing some of those things out. Where I start to get concerned is if I'm hearing organizations say, right, we've got a goal of 50 Kaizen or rapid improvement events. And then they're just trying to do them because they want to reach that KPI because they don't want to be seen as deficient. And it's like, you don't want a project to be a project just to be a project. It's kind of like running a report to be a report to say you printed it, but you're not doing anything meaningful or purposeful with it. It's waste.
I was going to ask this a little later on, but it seems appropriate now. Not everyone comes into leadership roles with a background in working directly with people through difficult situations like you did when you worked in hospice. For leaders who maybe came up through operations or finance or some other field, how can those leaders develop that empathy muscle for leading change and leading organizations?
Yeah, so I would say, right, I didn't start as a superpower social worker with this innate skill. Even as a social worker, right, I have had to build up those skills to be able to feel comfortable and confident in having those conversations with individuals about end of life care and choices and quality of life. And those are really difficult. Those are really difficult discussions to have. But I think it's the same thing. What helped me build those skills, and for individuals who didn't maybe step into like a human services or social services type role, active listening and building that skill and active listening. So when I say active listening, I'm listening to hear what the person is telling me. I'm not listening to formulate a response and jump in before they finish or cut them off. And it's about also listening and looking to like body language and tone. It's working to be able to rephrase what you hear individuals say that shows that you're listening and you're paying attention. It also requires perspective, right? And we talk about, right, being able to think about if you put yourself in their shoes, right? And I think, right, being able to engage in the acts that show compassion, like kindness, just checking in with individuals, say, hey, like I haven't, especially because we live in a very virtual or hybrid world where people may not see their coworkers face to face, being able to just kind of send a text message and email saying, hey, checking in, how are things going? Like, hey, you said that you've had this really important personal event, like that was coming up. How did things go? Or you were studying for this test. How did it go? So being able to kind of just check in and maybe some of those everyday moments and being mindful, right? Being present, giving people, we talked about active listening, but it's also about giving full attention.
Giving full attention. Thanks, April. To our listeners, I hope you will give your full attention to this short break. MoreSteam's enterprise process improvement platform includes the tools, training, and software you need to transform your organization into a problem-solving powerhouse. Join the ranks of Fortune 500 companies that trust MoreSteam for their enterprise process improvement. Visit MoreSteam.com to learn more. Also, I want to take just a moment to thank you for listening to Quality Time with MoreSteam. You can email the show at qualitytime@moresteam.com. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast service. And now back to my conversation with April Thomas. Is there anything we haven't touched on yet that you would like to talk about?
I think one of the things when we're talking about, right, continuous improvement and the concepts around mental health, and then we start thinking about change and being able to think about, like, so for those organizations, especially those that are looking at like statistical process control, and they're looking at data, and you need to have really strong data, and how does that fit in with mental health and especially psychological safety? And so being able to think about how do those concepts complement one another, right? Because organizations want to have good data, but your people aren't going to be providing you good data if they are worried or concerned or full of fear about if the data they're going to be providing you doesn't align with what you want it to be or what you want it to tell you. And so thinking about, right, so, enabling, like we're saying, right, the data collection and being able to look at having a good data collection, right? SBC tells us, right, the data that we need to have, that we want to be able to have, we want it to be accurate, and we want the data to be reported honestly. People need to feel psychologically safe in order to do that, so that there's transparency. It's ensuring the data reflects the reality, as I was saying, not what people want it to be. You don't want people to misinterpret or hide data or dismiss out of control points or information because they're afraid. SPC will be able to help look at things that say maybe a process isn't stable or it needs some investigating. And so psychological safety allows teams to be able to ask, okay, why did this happen, or why is this happening? Again, instead of being able to hide the problems, we don't want to be blaming individuals. We want to be able to look at the system because looking at the system is essential when we start talking about continuous improvement. And the goal is about looking at the system and making things better for everybody. And we want to be able to reduce fear, right? So psychological safety is really the antidote to fear when we start talking about process and continuous improvement. So if you want, whether we're talking about SPC or continuous improvement in general, and we need to make sure that individuals feel like they can voice the concerns, that they can share what they're seeing to be able to help support and drive the discussion. So it's SBC is going to be is a tool to be able to understand variation. But psychological safety is really about what are the conditions that are required for people to be able to use the tools honestly, effectively, and accurately.
Thank you so much, April. I'm glad you brought that up.
Being an advocate, a catalyst, and a coach for transformational change. So that became my why statement. And I ended up creating that in July of 2021. And we all have these kind of crucible moments that shape us that we don't forget. And that came out of one of those life moments where I had a niece who was killed by a highway care driver. And
I'm so sorry.
And there's in that kind of time, in that reflection and that grieving process, and being able to reflect on that was like when I was writing down all of these things, right? And this whole kind of like just writing dump. And that's really kind of where that why statement came from. And where it was like, poof, right? Like that really hits home, right? Like, and being able to reflect on, right? Like, what will help me feel like I have a life that has meaning and purpose and fulfillment? How can I make a difference? And being able to be like, yeah, like I want to be that advocate and catalyst and coach for transformational change. Like I said, taking that time. And that's really also what got me started in talking about grief and loss and what is grief-informed leadership and how to help leaders understand how grief and loss shows up. Whether we're talking about change management, which feels a little bit easier to be able to talk about grief and loss as it relates to change. But what do you do as an organization when you have somebody who dies at work and people are called to be able to help support them and they do everything they can? What do you do when there's something that's really tragic that happens that ends in the loss of somebody's life, a team member's life? What do you do if there's unfortunately like a natural disaster that impacts your organization? And even just individuals who experience a lot of different life transitions and losses that take place. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death. It can be a change or a transition in health or caring for a loved one. There's a lot of different types of losses that take place. And that really also kind of helped me kind of step into that and said, I have a skill set and a comfort talking about death and dying and grief and loss where many people do not. And really kind of stepped into how do I transition and transform this skill set and this comfort I have in helping leaders thrive in this space that I'm not aware that any business schools help them prepare them for those conversations. But how do I help leaders build their comfort level for these conversations that take place even when you're having to lay individuals off? There's grief and loss, and there's grief that happens when individuals are still there, and there's survivor's guilt that happens for individuals who are still there. And so being able to kind of look at some of the skills that I developed as a social worker, how do I reapply them and how do I help others be able to learn and grow, like I said, in a space where I feel comfortable and many people don't, and many others don't. I'm happy to walk that journey with you. I understand the discomfort that comes with it. I didn't start my career as a social worker thinking I'm going to be a social worker working in hospice. It ended up being where I went and I loved it. And so, being able to kind of see how do I take those experiences and help others to be able to develop their skills, because there's going to be a time if you're a leader where you're going to have somebody come to you because you're experiencing a loss. And as a leader, you need to be able to hold space for that grief. And you don't have to have the answers, but showing up and being mindful and present is going to be absolutely critical. For any leaders out there, I think one of my favorite quotes is by Jay Danzy. And it's, your smile is your logo, your personality is your business card, and how you leave others feeling after having an experience with you becomes your trademark. And so I would say, right, what do you want your trademark to be? because that's how you need to work on being able to show up every day.
April, that was just fantastic. Thank you so much. I think just by listening to this episode, it will help many people become better leaders. And of course, I will have all of your contact information in the show notes. April, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a remarkable conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been really fabulous and fun chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, April. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more quality time with MoreSteam. Thanks again.